HFY floated in the observation chamber of the cloaked vessel, watching the blue planet spin slowly below. The alien researcher had been studying Earth for 3 months now, documenting what the Valdrian collective believed would be another routine species extinction event. Earth's inhabitants called themselves humans, and like so many other primitive civilizations, they seemed determined to destroy themselves over resources and territory. The monitoring equipment showed rising tensions across the planet. 2 massive power groups had formed over the past decade. The Global Federation controlled most of the western continents and ocean territories. The Eastern Coalition held the eastern land masses and had formed alliances with several smaller nations. Both sides had been building weapons and armies for years, and HFY could see the signs that every xenobiologist recognized. War was coming. From the orbital station, HFY watched the final diplomatic meetings fail. Human leaders shouted at each other through communication screens, making demands neither side would accept. The Federation wanted access to the Coalition's rare earth mining operations. The Coalition demanded Federation technology for water purification and food production. Neither group would share what the other needed. Even though their planet was slowly dying from pollution and climate damage, Captain Jake Morrison stood on the deck of the Federation warship Atlantic Dawn, looking out at the gray ocean. He had been a soldier for 15 years and had never seen anything like the massive fleet assembling around him. Hundreds of ships stretched to the horizon, carrying the most advanced weapons humanity had ever built. Jake knew that within days, maybe hours, those weapons would be pointed at other humans. On the other side of the planet, Colonel Lisa Hayes checked her equipment one final time. Coalition forces had been preparing for this moment for months, building defensive positions across Eastern Europe and Asia. Lisa had trained her soldiers well, but she wondered if training would matter when the shooting started. The Federation had superior naval power, but the Coalition had better ground defenses and more soldiers. Admiral Chris Baker received the final orders from Federation Command at exactly 0600 hours. The message was simple and direct. All diplomatic options had failed. Military action was authorized. Chris had spent 30 years in the Federation Navy, working his way up from a simple enlisted sailor to commanding the entire Pacific Fleet. He had always hoped this day would never come, but now it was here. Dr. Amy Ford was deep underground in a Coalition research facility when the first reports came in. Federation aircraft had crossed into Coalition airspace. Coalition missiles had been launched at Federation targets. The war everyone had feared was finally beginning. Amy was a scientist, not a soldier, but her work on defensive technologies might be the only thing standing between the Coalition and total defeat. HFY adjusted the monitoring equipment to track the opening moves of the conflict. The alien had studied 17 different species that had reached this same point in their development. 14 of those species had completely destroyed themselves within the first year of their final war. 2 had survived but been reduced to primitive levels. Only 1 had managed to avoid total destruction, and they had done so by surrendering completely to the stronger side. The first attacks were exactly what HFY expected. Federation naval forces struck Coalition coastal installations. Coalition land-based missiles hit Federation ships and aircraft. Both sides launched cyber attacks against each other's communication and power systems. Cities went dark as power grids failed. Supply lines were cut as transportation networks came under attack. Jake Morrison found himself in the first major naval battle of the war. Coalition submarines had surrounded his task force in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. For 6 hours, ships from both sides fired missiles and torpedoes at each other. Jake watched 3 Federation destroyers sink beneath the waves. He saw Coalition submarines surface only to be destroyed by Federation aircraft. The water turned black with oil and red with blood. Lisa Hayes commanded ground forces during the first Coalition victory of the war. Federation paratroopers had tried to capture a strategic mountain pass, but Lisa's soldiers were ready for them. The battle lasted for 2 days and nights. When it was over, neither side held the pass, but both sides had lost hundreds of soldiers. Lisa looked at the bodies scattered across the mountainside and wondered how many more would die before the war ended. The pattern continued for weeks. Federation forces would capture a Coalition city, only to lose it again when Coalition reinforcements arrived. Coalition armies would push Federation troops back to the sea, only to retreat when Federation ships appeared on the horizon. Neither side could achieve a decisive victory, but both sides kept fighting anyway. HFY documented each battle with scientific precision. The alien researcher noted the escalating use of more powerful weapons. Chemical weapons appeared in the second month. Biological weapons followed in the third month. Both sides seemed determined to use whatever force was necessary to defeat their enemies, even if it meant poisoning their own planet. Admiral Baker stood in the command center of the Federation flagship, looking at reports from around the world. Federation forces were winning some battles and losing others. The coalition was doing the same. What worried Baker most was not the military situation, but the reports of environmental damage. The weapons being used by both sides were causing massive pollution. Forests were dying. Rivers were turning toxic. The air itself was becoming dangerous to breathe. Dr. Ford received similar reports in her underground laboratory. Coalition intelligence showed that the Federation was developing even more destructive weapons. At the same time, Coalition scientists were working on weapons that could make entire continents uninhabitable. Amy realized that both sides were moving toward a level of destruction that would make victory meaningless. HFY began preparing the standard species extinction report that would be filed with the Valdrian Collective. The pattern was clear and familiar. Humans would continue escalating their conflict until they destroyed their planet's ability to support life. Within 2 years, maybe less, Earth would be another dead world orbiting a star, remembered only in collective archives as species classification 7432, self-terminated through warfare. But as HFY continued monitoring the conflict, something unexpected began to happen. In several areas where fighting had been particularly intense, both Federation and Coalition forces started encountering problems that had nothing to do with enemy action. Massive storms, created by all the weapons being used, began appearing without warning. Radiation from damaged power plants started spreading across battle zones. Chemical contamination made water sources unusable for both armies. The alien researcher noticed that human behavior in these crisis situations did not match any pattern in collective databases. Instead of using environmental disasters as weapons against their enemies, humans from both sides began helping each other survive the damage their war was causing. This made no sense according to everything the Valdrians knew about intelligent species during total war. HFY decided to monitor the situation more closely before filing the extinction report. 3 months after the war began, the planet itself started fighting back against the humans. A massive solar storm hit Earth just as nuclear weapons had filled the atmosphere with radiation and toxic particles. The combination created electrical storms unlike anything in recorded history. Lightning struck constantly across entire continents. Radio communications failed everywhere. Satellite systems went offline. Both the Federation and Coalition lost contact with most of their forces. Lieutenant Ben Clark was leading a Federation patrol through the ruins of what used to be Miami when the first megastorm hit. The sky turned green and purple as electrical energy danced between the clouds. Rain fell like acid, burning through metal and concrete. Ben's squad took shelter in an abandoned shopping center, but they could hear the building shaking as wind speeds reached over 200 miles per hour. Sergeant Kate Lopez had been leading a coalition reconnaissance team through the same area when the storm trapped them in a subway tunnel. The tunnel was flooding with radioactive water from damaged nuclear facilities upstream. Kate knew her team had maybe an hour before the water level rose high enough to drown them all. The radiation detectors were clicking so fast they sounded like machine guns. When the storm finally passed, Ben emerged from the shopping center to find a landscape that looked like another planet. The city was gone, replaced by twisted metal and smoking craters. His communication equipment was dead. Half his squad was injured. They needed medical supplies and clean water. But everything around them was contaminated or destroyed. Kate's team had managed to reach higher ground, but 3 of her soldiers were suffering from radiation poisoning. The antidote drugs in their medical kits were not strong enough for this level of exposure. Without better treatment, her people would be dead within days. She could see Federation soldiers in the distance, but according to everything she had been taught, they were the enemy. Ben spotted the Coalition soldiers on the other side of a massive crater filled with toxic water. His training told him to call for backup and attack them while they were weakened. But his radiation detector was showing that the area was getting more dangerous by the hour. They were all going to die if they stayed here much longer, and he could see that the Coalition soldiers were in the same situation. Kate made the decision first. She ordered her soldiers to put down their weapons and wave a white flag made from a torn uniform shirt. Ben watched through his binoculars as the coalition team signaled that they wanted to talk, not fight. Against every regulation he had ever learned, Ben told his squad to approach the coalition position with weapons lowered. The two groups met at the edge of the toxic crater. Kate's English was good enough for basic communication. Ben could speak some of the coalition languages. They quickly realized that both teams had the same problem. The radiation was getting stronger. The storm had damaged underground nuclear storage facilities, and radioactive material was spreading through the groundwater. Everyone in the area would be dead soon unless they worked together to find a way out. Kate had medical supplies that could help Ben's injured soldiers. Ben had water purification equipment that could make the contaminated water safe to drink. Kate's team knew the location of an underground shelter that might protect them from radiation. Ben's team had vehicles that could carry everyone to safety if they could find fuel that had not been contaminated. Together, they spent the next 18 hours fighting their way through the devastated landscape. Coalition soldiers carried wounded Federation troops when the Federation soldiers were too injured to walk. Federation soldiers shared their food with Coalition soldiers when the Coalition rations ran out. Nobody talked about the war. They only talked about survival. Dr. Ryan Moore was working in a Coalition field hospital when Ben and Kate's combined group arrived. Ryan had been treating Coalition soldiers for 3 months, but when he saw Federation wounded among the group, he did not hesitate. Medical training was stronger than military loyalty. He treated the Federation soldiers with the same care he gave to Coalition troops. The story of the combined Federation-Coalition group spread quickly through both military organizations. Communication systems were slowly coming back online, and field commanders on both sides heard about soldiers working together instead of fighting. Some commanders ordered their troops to arrest any soldiers who cooperated with the enemy. Other commanders quietly told their troops to use their own judgment when survival was at stake. Major Tony Garcia was flying a Federation fighter jet when his engine failed over Coalition territory. His aircraft crashed in a forest that was burning from chemical weapons used earlier in the war. Tony expected to be captured or killed when Coalition ground forces found him. Instead, Coalition medics pulled him from the wreckage and treated his injuries while Coalition firefighters worked to contain the chemical fire that was spreading toward several villages. The Coalition soldiers could have let Tony die or taken him prisoner. Instead, they risked their own lives to save an enemy pilot. When Federation rescue teams arrived, they found Tony being cared for in a Coalition medical tent. The Coalition soldiers could have used Tony as a human shield or demanded Federation prisoners in exchange. Instead, they simply asked the Federation medics to continue Tony's treatment and sent him home. Zexhai watched these events with growing confusion. Every database in collective archives showed that species at war always treated enemies as expendable resources. Prisoners were used for information or slave labor. Wounded enemies were left to die or killed outright. Enemy civilians were considered acceptable targets. But humans seemed to be breaking every rule of warfare that the Valdrians had observed across dozens of other species. Professor Helen White was working in a Federation chemical weapons laboratory when reports arrived about a Coalition accident. Coalition forces had been trying to neutralize a Federation chemical weapon depot when their equipment malfunctioned. Toxic gas was spreading across a region where both Federation and Coalition civilians lived in refugee camps. Thousands of people would die unless the gas could be neutralized quickly. Helen had developed the original weapon, so she knew exactly how to counteract it. Federation Command ordered her to keep the neutralization process secret and let Coalition forces figure it out on their own. Helen looked at the satellite images showing children running from the toxic cloud and disobeyed direct orders. She contacted Coalition scientists and gave them the complete formula for neutralizing the gas. Coalition aircraft dropped Helen's neutralization compound across the affected region. The toxic cloud dissipated within hours instead of days. Federation civilians and Coalition civilians were saved equally. When Federation Command learned what Helen had done, they arrested her for treason. When Coalition Command learned what she had done, they broadcast a message to Federation forces thanking Helen by name and promising that Coalition forces would protect any Federation scientist who chose to help save civilian lives. The pattern continued across the planet. Federation engineer Sam Foster developed water purification systems and shared the designs with coalition forces when coalition cities lost access to clean water. Coalition biologist Dr. Laura Kim created new food preservation techniques and gave the information to Federation researchers when Federation agricultural areas were contaminated by biological weapons. Communications specialist Alex Turner worked for the Federation, but helped establish communication networks that included both Federation and coalition emergency services. When natural disasters struck areas controlled by either side, rescue teams from both organizations used Alex's networks to coordinate their efforts. Nobody asked whether victims were Federation or coalition before sending help. HFY realized that something unprecedented was happening. Humans were not following the standard pattern of total war that led to species extinction. Instead, they were developing a new pattern that the Valdrian collective had never observed. Humans were somehow fighting two wars at the same time, a war against each other, and a war against the environmental destruction that their first war was causing. More importantly, when humans had to choose between winning the war against their enemies and winning the war against environmental destruction, they were choosing to save their planet even if it meant helping their enemies. This behavior made no sense according to any model of intelligent behavior that the Valdrians possessed. Sergeant Nick Brown organized joint rescue missions with coalition counterparts when earthquakes triggered by underground weapons testing destroyed cities on both sides of the war. Physician Dr. Maria Santos treated wounded from both armies when field hospitals were overwhelmed by casualties from environmental disasters. Farmer Joe Patterson shared his remaining seeds with refugees regardless of whether they were Federation or coalition citizens. The war was still raging in many areas, but in other areas, Federation and coalition forces were working together to fight hurricanes, toxic spills, radiation leaks, and biological contamination. Humans were proving that they could be enemies and allies at the same time, depending on what kind of threat they were facing. HFY postponed filing the species extinction report and requested additional observation time from the collective. By the end of the first year, the war had changed everything about life on Earth. Nuclear explosions had thrown so much dust and radiation into the atmosphere that temperatures were dropping rapidly. The planet was entering an artificial winter that could last for decades. Crops were failing worldwide. Ocean currents were changing as radiation killed marine life. Both the Federation and coalition were discovering that winning the war might mean ruling over a dead planet. General Paul Roberts sat in the Federation Command Center, looking at reports that made victory seem meaningless. Federation forces controlled more territory than they had at the beginning of the war, but most of that territory was now uninhabitable. Radiation levels were too high for civilians. Water sources were contaminated. The air itself was toxic in many regions. Roberts realized that the Federation might win every battle and still lose everything that mattered. Marshal Diana Webb faced the same problem from the coalition perspective. Coalition forces had successfully defended most of their original territory, but defending dead land was not much of an achievement. Coalition scientists estimated that if current trends continued, the planet would be unable to support human life within 5 years. Both sides were racing toward a finish line that no longer existed. The first secret communication between Roberts and Webb happened almost by accident. A coalition communication satellite that should have been destroyed months earlier was still functioning. Federation technicians detected coalition emergency broadcasts asking for help with a nuclear reactor that was melting down near coalition civilians. Roberts made a decision that would have been impossible at the beginning of the war. He ordered Federation nuclear experts to respond to the coalition. Request engineer Sam Foster had been working on atmospheric processing technology for 6 months when he realized that his project could never succeed with only Federation resources. The equipment needed rare Earth elements that only existed in coalition territory. The power requirements were so massive that they needed energy plants from both sides of the war. Most importantly, atmospheric processing had to be coordinated across the entire planet or it would not work at all. Sam sent a message directly to coalition scientists, bypassing all military channels. He explained that both sides were working on the same problem: how to reverse the atmospheric damage caused by the war. Sam offered to share Federation research if coalition scientists would share their data. Within days, Sam was participating in secret scientific conferences that included researchers from both armies. Biologist Dr. Laura Kim was leading the coalition effort to preserve genetic material from plants and animals that were going extinct because of environmental damage. Laura's team had managed to save seeds and genetic samples from thousands of species, but they knew that Federation territories contained species that did not exist anywhere else. If those species were lost, they would be gone forever. Laura contacted Federation biologist Dr. Helen White through the same unofficial channels that Sam Foster was using. Helen had been working on the same project from the Federation side. Together, they developed a plan to create genetic storage facilities in secure locations controlled by both armies. Coalition forces would protect Federation genetic samples, and Federation forces would protect Coalition samples. The cooperation between scientists led to cooperation between military units that were responsible for protecting scientific facilities. Captain Jake Morrison found himself coordinating with Coalition officers to establish secure zones around research installations. Colonel Lisa Hayes worked with Federation commanders to ensure that scientific equipment could be transported safely across battle lines. Zexhai observed these developments with fascination. The alien researcher had never seen a species attempt to solve problems through cooperation while still maintaining active warfare. According to Valdrian models, species either fought until one side achieved total victory, or they negotiated peace agreements that ended the fighting. Humans seem to be creating a third option: selective cooperation during ongoing conflict. Admiral Chris Baker received orders from Federation Command to destroy Coalition research facilities that were working on atmospheric processing. Baker studied the orders for hours before making his decision. He sent a message back to Command explaining that destroying the Coalition facilities would also destroy Federation research, since both sides were now sharing data and equipment. Baker recommended that Federation forces should protect Coalition scientists instead of attacking them. Dr. Amy Ford was working in a deep underground laboratory when Coalition forces broke through Federation defenses and captured the facility. Amy expected to be arrested or killed. Instead, the Coalition commander, Colonel Lisa Hayes, asked Amy to continue her research on defensive technologies. Lisa explained that Coalition forces needed the same protection from radiation and chemical weapons that Amy had been developing for Federation troops. The unofficial cooperation spread beyond scientific research. Communications specialist Alex Turner helped establish networks that allowed both Federation and Coalition emergency services to coordinate disaster response. When massive storms hit the North American continent, Federation and Coalition rescue teams worked together to evacuate civilians from coastal areas that were flooding with radioactive water. Pilot Danny Clark was flying Federation supply missions to scientific installations when his aircraft was intercepted by Coalition fighters. Instead of attacking, the Coalition pilots escorted Danny's aircraft through dangerous airspace and helped him avoid areas where radiation levels were lethal. Coalition navigator Lisa Park explained over the radio that everyone was fighting the same enemy now: the environmental collapse that threatened all human life. The pattern was repeated in hundreds of locations across the planet. Federation engineer Kevin Jones repaired Coalition equipment when Coalition facilities lost power during radiation storms. Coalition technician Mary Bell fixed Federation systems when Federation installations were damaged by earthquakes caused by underground weapons testing. The divisions between armies became less important than the cooperation needed for species survival. Zex's High began documenting what the alien researcher called the Great Convergence. Humans were demonstrating the ability to maintain two completely different types of relationships simultaneously. They could be military enemies, competing for territory and resources while also being cooperative. Partners working to solve shared survival problems. This dual relationship structure was unprecedented in collective databases. Other species formed alliances or maintained hostilities, but never both at the same time. Humans seemed to be able to switch between conflict mode and cooperation mode depending on the type of challenge they faced. When the challenge was military, they fought each other. When the challenge was environmental, they helped each other. Admiral Pete Stone commanded Federation naval forces in the Atlantic Ocean when the first coordinated environmental response operation began. Coalition and Federation ships worked together to contain a massive oil spill that had been caused by underwater weapons testing. Stone's fleet provided transportation while Coalition ships provided technical expertise. Neither side attempted to gain military advantage during the environmental mission. General Carroll Murphy led Coalition ground forces in the same region. Murphy's troops established security perimeters around environmental cleanup sites, while Federation aircraft provided air cover. Both armies treated environmental protection zones as neutral territory where military conflict was temporarily suspended. Dr. Phil Grant had been developing weapons for the Federation when he received a message from Coalition scientist Dr. Ruby Adams. Ruby explained that both sides were working on the same environmental restoration projects and asked if Phil would consider switching from weapons research to environmental research. Phil realized that developing better weapons was pointless if there would be no habitable planet left to fight over. Within 6 months, Phil was leading joint Federation-Coalition research teams. His former expertise in chemical weapons became valuable for neutralizing chemical contamination. His knowledge of biological weapons helped develop treatments for biological contamination. Phil's career change from weapons developer to environmental restorer became a model that other scientists on both sides began to follow. The cooperation was not limited to scientific and military personnel. Farmer Joe Patterson discovered that his agricultural techniques for growing crops in contaminated soil could help farmers on both sides of the war. Joe began teaching Coalition farmers the same methods he was teaching Federation farmers. Food production became a shared challenge that required shared solutions. Physician Dr. Maria Santos treated patients from both armies when medical facilities were overwhelmed by casualties from environmental disasters. Maria realized that radiation poisoning and chemical exposure affected Coalition soldiers exactly the same way they affected Federation soldiers. The treatments that worked for one army also worked for the other army. Sexhai recognized that humans were redefining the concept of victory during warfare. Instead of victory meaning the defeat of their enemies, humans were beginning to define victory as the survival of their species. 2 years into the war, both Federation and Coalition scientists reached the same terrifying conclusion. The environmental damage was accelerating beyond their ability to repair it. Atmospheric radiation was increasing instead of decreasing. Ocean acidity was rising as carbon dioxide levels climbed higher. Global temperatures were dropping so fast that major agricultural regions would be frozen wastelands within 5 years. Earth was entering a death spiral that would end all human life unless drastic action was taken immediately. The solution existed, but it required something that had never been attempted in the history of warfare. Both sides would have to coordinate the simultaneous detonation of their remaining nuclear arsenals in a precise pattern designed to clear atmospheric radiation and reset global weather systems. The explosions would have to be perfectly timed and positioned according to calculations that required cooperation between Federation and Coalition scientists, engineers, and military forces. Colonel Scott Allen was the Federation's leading expert on nuclear weapons when he received the classified proposal. Scott had spent his entire career learning how to use nuclear weapons to destroy enemies. Now he was being asked to use those same weapons to save everyone, including the enemies he had been fighting for 2 years. The plan would require Federation forces to share their most secret military technology with Coalition forces. Commander Betty Ross led the Coalition's nuclear weapons program. Betty had designed most of the Coalition's nuclear arsenal specifically to counter Federation weapons. The new plan would require Betty to work directly with Federation weapons experts like Scott Allen. More importantly, the plan would require both sides to give up their nuclear weapons permanently. After the coordinated detonation, neither the Federation nor the Coalition would have any nuclear deterrent capability. The proposal was presented to military leadership on both sides simultaneously. General Paul Roberts and Marshal Diana Webb participated in the first official communication between Federation and Coalition commanders since the war began. The conversation lasted for 6 hours and covered every aspect of the nuclear reset plan. Both leaders understood that approving the plan would essentially end their respective nations as military powers. Admiral Chris Baker studied the technical requirements for the nuclear reset operation. Federation naval forces would have to transport Coalition nuclear specialists to Federation submarine bases. Coalition ground forces would have to provide security for Federation missile installations. Federation aircraft would have to carry Coalition technical equipment to detonation sites controlled by the Federation. Every aspect of the operation required unprecedented cooperation between enemies. Dr. Amy Ford worked with Coalition scientist Dr. Ryan Moore to calculate the precise timing needed for the nuclear reset. The margin for error was so small that a timing mistake of even a few seconds could cause the plan to fail completely. Amy and Ryan had to trust each other with calculations that would determine whether human civilization survived or ended forever. The technical challenges were enormous, but the political challenges were even greater. Federation soldiers would have to take orders from Coalition commanders in some situations. Coalition troops would have to follow Federation officers in other situations. Both armies would have to treat former enemies as trusted partners while preparing to eliminate their own ability to defend themselves. Lieutenant Ben Clark and Sergeant Kate Lopez had been working together in joint environmental missions for over a year. Now they were assigned to security teams that would protect nuclear reset installations. Ben's Federation squad and Kate's Coalition squad would provide joint protection for scientists and engineers from both sides. They had learned to trust each other during environmental emergencies, but this mission would test that trust in ways they had never. Experienced pilot Danny Clark received orders to fly Coalition nuclear experts to Federation missile bases in the Pacific Ocean. Danny's aircraft would be escorted by Coalition fighters through Coalition airspace, then by Federation fighters through Federation airspace. Any breakdown in cooperation could result in Coalition pilots shooting down Federation aircraft, or Federation pilots shooting down Coalition aircraft. Everyone's survival depended on former enemies protecting each other. Engineer Kevin Jones and Coalition technician Mary Bell were assigned to work together on the most critical aspect of the nuclear reset plan. They would be responsible for the final countdown sequence that would trigger the coordinated detonation. Kevin would control Federation weapons systems while Mary controlled Coalition systems. Both of them would have to press their activation buttons at exactly the same moment, or the entire plan would fail. Zexhai watched the preparation for the nuclear reset with amazement. The alien researcher had never observed a species voluntarily destroy its own military capability. According to every model in collective databases, military power was the foundation of species survival during warfare. Humans were choosing to eliminate their ability to wage war in order to preserve their ability to survive as a species. Admiral Pete Stone commanded the Federation Naval Task Force that would transport Coalition nuclear materials to detonation sites in the Atlantic Ocean. Stone's ships would be carrying weapons that had been designed to destroy Federation cities. Coalition weapons specialists would be working alongside Federation crews to prepare those weapons for detonation. Stone realized that he was trusting former enemies with the power to destroy his own fleet. General Carol Murphy led Coalition ground forces that would secure Federation missile installations during the final phase of the nuclear reset operation. Murphy's soldiers would be protecting Federation weapons that could destroy Coalition cities. Federation technicians would be working inside Coalition security perimeters to prepare weapons for launch. Murphy understood that she was betting her soldiers' lives on the assumption that Federation forces would not betray their Coalition partners. Dr. Phil Grant and Dr. Ruby Adams had been working together on environmental restoration for 6 months when they were assigned to the nuclear reset project. Phil's expertise in Federation weapon systems and Ruby's knowledge of Coalition nuclear technology would be essential for calculating the proper detonation sequence. They would have to combine their knowledge in ways that revealed their respective nations' most closely guarded military secrets. The final planning sessions took place in secure facilities that were jointly operated by Federation and Coalition forces. Federation General Paul Roberts and Coalition Marshal Diana Webb worked side by side with scientists, engineers, and military specialists from both armies. Everyone in the room understood that they were planning the end of the war, but not through victory or defeat. They were planning the end of the war through mutual disarmament and shared survival. Communications specialist Alex Turner established the secure communication networks that would coordinate the nuclear reset operation. Alex's networks would carry the final countdown signals to detonation sites around the planet. Federation and Coalition forces would receive the same signals at the same time. There would be no way for either side to abort the mission without the cooperation of the other side. The psychological pressure on individual soldiers and scientists was enormous. Sergeant Nick Brown had been fighting coalition forces for 2 years, and now he was assigned to protect coalition weapons specialists who were working at Federation installations. Nick had to overcome months of military conditioning that taught him to see coalition soldiers as enemies who should be killed or captured. Dr. Maria Santos worked in joint medical facilities where Federation and coalition personnel received treatment together. Maria knew that some of the people she was treating had probably killed soldiers from her own side during the war, but she also knew that those same people were now risking their lives to save everyone on the planet, including people who had been their enemies. Farmer Joe Patterson had been growing food for Federation refugees, but now he was also growing food for coalition personnel who were working on the nuclear reset project. Joe realized that after the nuclear reset, there would be no more Federation or coalition. There would only be humans working together to survive on a damaged planet. The final decision point arrived exactly 26 months after the war began. Both Federation and coalition leadership had to give final authorization for the nuclear reset operation. General Roberts and Marshal Webb held their last official communication as military commanders of opposing armies. After this conversation, they would become civilian administrators of a unified human survival effort. Zexhai observed the moment when both human leaders simultaneously authorized the nuclear reset operation. The alien researcher understood that this decision represented something unprecedented in galactic history. Two intelligent species that had been engaged in total warfare chose to destroy their own military capabilities rather than destroy each other. Humans had proven that survival instinct could be stronger than competitive instinct, even during active conflict. The countdown to the nuclear reset began with coordination between former enemies who had become partners in species survival. Everyone involved understood that success would mean the end of human military power for generations. The nuclear reset operation succeeded beyond all expectations. 347 nuclear weapons detonated simultaneously at precisely calculated locations around the planet. The coordinated explosions cleared atmospheric radiation, disrupted toxic weather patterns, and began the process of restoring normal climate cycles. For the first time in 2 years, scientists could measure decreasing radiation levels and stabilizing temperatures. Earth would heal, but the price had been enormous. Both the Global Federation and the Eastern Coalition ceased to exist as military organizations within hours of the nuclear reset. Neither side had any remaining nuclear weapons. Most conventional military equipment had been destroyed or converted to civilian use during the environmental recovery efforts. The armies that had fought for over 2 years were now civilian, disaster relief organizations, working together to help their planet recover from the damage they had caused. General Paul Roberts and Marshal Diana Webb met in person for the first time 3 months after the nuclear reset. They were no longer military commanders of opposing armies. Roberts had become the head of the North American Recovery Zone. Webb was directing the Eurasian Restoration Project. Both of them were working for the same organization, the United Earth Recovery Administration, which had been formed by combining personnel and resources from both former armies. Zexhai watched the transformation with fascination. The alien researcher had expected the nuclear reset to be followed by a new war, as both sides competed for control of the recovering planet. Instead, humans had created something that the Valdrian Collective had never observed. They had formed a unified government that focused entirely on planetary restoration and species survival. Former Federation General Andy Baker and former Coalition Colonel Nancy Young worked together as civilian administrators in the South American Recovery Zone. Andy had been responsible for developing some of the weapons that caused the environmental damage. Nancy had commanded coalition forces that used chemical weapons against Federation cities. Now they were coordinating reforestation projects and atmospheric monitoring systems. The transition from military to civilian organization happened remarkably quickly. Captain Jake Morrison became a construction supervisor, who built new cities designed to be environmentally sustainable. Colonel Lisa Hayes managed transportation networks that carried supplies and equipment to restoration projects around the world. Admiral Chris Baker directed ocean cleanup efforts that removed radiation and chemical contamination from marine environments. Dr. Amy Ford continued her research, but instead of developing defensive technologies for the coalition, She was now developing life support systems for the entire planet. Dr. Ryan Moore worked with Amy on medical technologies that could treat the long-term health effects of radiation and chemical exposure. Their research benefited everyone equally, regardless of which side they had fought for during the war. The agricultural restoration program was led by people who had been enemies during the war. Dr. Phil Grant and Dr. Ruby Adams worked together to develop new farming techniques that could produce food in soil that was still contaminated from military operations. Engineer Sam Foster and coalition technician Mary Bell designed atmospheric processors that could clean the air in regions where chemical weapons had been used. HFY realized that the humans had not simply ended their war. They had transformed their entire civilization. The competitive resource conflicts that had caused the war were being resolved through cooperative sharing and technological innovation. The territorial disputes that had triggered military action were being settled through joint administration and environmental restoration. Communications specialist Alex Turner established planetary communication networks that connected all recovery zones. Former Federation pilot Danny Clark and former Coalition navigator Lisa Park worked together to provide transportation services for scientific teams and construction crews. The cooperation that had begun during environmental emergencies had become the foundation for a new type of human society. Lieutenant Ben Clark and Sergeant Kate Lopez were assigned to security teams that protected restoration projects from environmental hazards rather than human enemies. Their joint Federation Coalition squad had become a model for integrated security forces throughout the recovery zones. Ben and Kate had learned to work together during the war, and now they were teaching other former enemies how to cooperate for planetary restoration. The psychological changes in individual humans were as remarkable as the organizational changes. Sergeant Nick Brown had spent 2 years learning to see Coalition soldiers as enemies. After the nuclear reset, Nick had to learn to see those same people as partners in species survival. The process was difficult, but Nick discovered that cooperation was more psychologically rewarding than conflict. Dr. Maria Santos continued treating patients from both former armies, but now she was also training new medical personnel who had never been soldiers. Maria realized that the generation of humans growing up after the nuclear reset would have no memory of the Federation Coalition conflict. They would think of planetary restoration and cooperative survival as normal instead of remarkable. Farmer Joe Patterson expanded his agricultural operations to include former military bases that were being converted to food production facilities. Joe worked with farmers from both sides of the former conflict to develop new crops that could grow in contaminated soil. The sharing of agricultural knowledge that had begun during the war became the foundation for feeding the recovering human population. 2 years after the nuclear reset, HFY filed a report with the Valdrian Collective that fundamentally challenged everything the collective thought they knew about intelligent species. The report was classified as a priority species reassessment and distributed to xenobiologists throughout collective space. The document concluded that humans represented a completely new form of intelligence that required extensive additional study. The report explained that humans possessed a unique ability to redefine the concept of victory during conflict. While other species fought until one side achieved dominance over the other side, humans could collectively choose to end conflicts through mutual sacrifice when continuation of fighting threatened species survival. This behavior pattern had never been observed in any other intelligent species. HFY's analysis showed that human cooperation during environmental crises was not simply a temporary response to emergency conditions. Instead, it represented a fundamental aspect of human psychology that could override competitive instincts when survival was at stake. Humans could be simultaneously competitive and cooperative, depending on the type of challenge they faced. The alien researcher documented the most important discovery of the entire study. Humans had proven that military victory could be less important than species survival. When forced to choose between defeating their enemies and preserving their civilization, humans chose preservation. This choice had required levels of trust and cooperation that no other species had demonstrated during active warfare. The Valdrian Collective reviewed HFY's report and reached a unanimous decision. Earth would be reclassified from primitive pre-contact species to strategic observation priority, with a recommendation that contact should be considered only after extensive additional study. The report noted that any species capable of such coordinated self-sacrifice during total war represented a form of intelligence that could not be predicted or understood using existing collective models. HFY remained in Earth orbit, continuing to observe human recovery efforts. The alien researcher was no longer studying humanity's potential extinction. Instead, HFY was trying to understand how a species could be capable of such devastating warfare and such unprecedented cooperation at the same time. The contradictions in human behavior made them the most interesting species the Valdrians had ever encountered. 5 years after the nuclear reset, Earth's environment had stabilized and begun improving. Human population levels were recovering. New technologies were being developed specifically for sustainable planetary management. The humans had not only survived their most destructive war, but they had used the experience to build a more cooperative civilization. The final entry in HFY's ongoing research log noted that humans had demonstrated something that challenged the fundamental assumptions of galactic civilization. They had proven that intelligence, competition, cooperation, and survival instinct could be combined in ways that produced outcomes beneficial to entire species rather than just dominant groups within species. The alien researcher concluded that the truth of World War III was not that humanity had nearly destroyed itself. The real truth was that when faced with the possibility of self-destruction, humanity chose to destroy everything except itself. Humans had sacrificed their military power, their national identities, and their competitive advantages in order to preserve their species and their planet. This level of collective sacrifice for species survival had never been documented in collective archives. Humans had redefined what it meant to be intelligent. They had shown that the highest form of intelligence was knowing when to stop fighting and start cooperating, even with former enemies.